All right, Psalm 3, let's call this one. You want him to bless one way when he's really blessing another in this chapter, where David asks a question: how many are my foes? In a chapter described as a psalm that he penned as he fled from Absalom, his son, after having sinned with Bathsheba. Absalom taking over the throne for a period of time was part of the consequence that David suffered for taking Uriah's wife and essentially having Uriah killed. And so as David enters this period of exile, it reminded me a lot of what we just studied in the book of Job, because in David's period of weakness, he is now being faced with a good number of enemies he never necessarily knew that he had. Likewise, Job, in his sickness, not having anything to do with any sin he committed, still was able to find some bitterness in the hearts of friends that he thought were friends, but they harbored some bitterness that he didn't necessarily know that they had. And so David, even though he is suffering exile because of his mischief, has an upside, meaning that he is having a period of revelation in his kingdom when he is finding out who is really with him. And much like we noticed with Job, even though adversity has the potential to take us under, as rough seas might sink a ship, there were certain parts of Job's character that continue to resurface like a buoy, his integrity being not the least of those. Here, David's courage resurfaces because the psalm is going to go on to note that even though he might be surrounded by many peoples, he is not going to be afraid, and that is going to be for good reason. Because if you remember how the story develops, even though David had some unseen enemies in his camp, he also had some help arise from places he might not have otherwise been able to expect it, as one of the Philistines who followed him from his earlier period of exile as he fled Saul becomes commander of a third of the army he's able to put together as he takes the throne back from Absalom. As Psalm 3 goes on to say some other things that are similar to Job's story, when David goes on to say, you strike all my enemies on the cheek and you break the teeth of the wicked, not necessarily talking about the literal teeth of the wicked, but reminiscent of the way Job described himself in his prime as pulling the vulnerable or those who are exploited by the powerful out of the teeth of the wicked. David is describing the way that God himself breaks the power of the mighty over those whom they might exploit, before he goes on to conclude that God's blessings are on his people, which reminded me of a story that I'm pretty sure I've told before, but it's from a movie where a young woman was describing her perspective on God and Jesus, and she said they're a lot like Obama, where he's really kind of whatever you want him to be. And so Jesus is kind of whoever you want him to be. As she was describing Obama as somebody who she knows exists one way, but in her mind, he does some things that were completely out of character for him, but made him more acceptable for the way she would like to see him, pointing back to what we noticed in the last chapter, and that is our temptation to try to make Christ one way when he is really another. This chapter may be showing us the way in which we have the ability to recreate Christ into whoever we want him to be, but it would be super unwise to expect God to bless us for following a Christ we created. Understanding that, as we've noticed, David's forgiveness in this chapter, the forgiveness that opened his door to going back to the throne of Israel, required some forgiveness, understanding that he committed sins punishable by death. David essentially had a man killed in order to take his wife. Another king by the name of Ahab essentially had a man killed to take his land. Both Ahab and David were forgiven, but only David's forgiveness endured. And we notice that God is not playing favorites by blessing David with a forgiveness that endured. David simply made a different use of his forgiveness by simply going back to following God the way he was, whereas Ahab wore out his welcome, as we sometimes say in the South, by taking his forgiveness and going back to following God the way he wanted him to be. Ahab, having found a blessing from God in the form of forgiveness, wore out his welcome in that forgiveness by going back to the habit of serving only the portions of God he was willing to see.